Excellent. Without further ado, I call this House into order and call upon the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
So Poland has a rich history as a great country in Europe before the time of the USSR. The Balkans have been states either as part of a larger state or on their own prior to the USSR. We have rich histories to unite us. We have a culture, we have a people, we have a heritage, and we don't believe that we should define who we are now by possible resistance to an external force. We're going to talk to you in this debate, first of all, on how this would incur Russian meddling that not only prevents us from building this specific narrative, but any narrative and eroding society itself. Second, we're going to say why, even if it doesn't, building a narrative as a nation in opposition to another nation is something that is detrimental to our society and should not be done. First of all, a few things on clarification. The counterfactual here is that we're going to emphasize the positive, the identity, the things that have been preserved despite the USSR, and how great of a people has preserved it, how our culture and heritage do unite us. We're going to say this is a positive in how great a people is and how we should stay united. Second of all, the countries we're talking about are countries who did actively fight against the USSR. We're not talking about states who are to this day puppet states or in no way fighting against Russia. And finally, let it be clear, when we're saying struggle, we don't mean empty political statements on how this might not be nice or we are not happy about this, but active militant struggle in fighting against the USSR, trying to get them out, not just making empty statements. Does anyone wish to contest that definition of the debate? Great. Okay, let's talk about Russian meddling in society, how this is going to be harmful, and why is it specific to Russia. We say that since 1700 or so, Russia historically and today work by a doctrine that the most important thing is to secure their borders. This has shaped a mental state within the country, which is why also Putin talks about greater Russia and protecting it and ensuring its safety. This is easy for Putin to sell to their people. We say, because of this, Russia constantly worries that all states bordering Russia and all states influencing it are as pro-Russian as possible. In that sense, we say they also see this as a zero-sum game due to the memory of NATO and the EU trying to bite at their influence, and the Cold War, where the West actively tried to get in a closer and closer foothold to Russian borders in order to dominate the world. We say that even if they don't do it today, this mindset has been set in Russia because they have learned it. Their parents lived under this. They taught them this in schools. They teach them that this is how things are, and therefore makes it extremely easy for Putin to continuously peddle this narrative to the people. Why is this important? Because what we say is that Russia constantly checks the mindset in states surrounding it. They do wonder who is anti-Russian, who are saying that they oppose them or have a strong narrative of this is something that it was against us. Russia has conquered us. They have wronged us in the past, and we have a history of fighting them and opposing them actively. Why? What do they do when they see a state doing this? We say, sure, the extreme case might be that they send an army as they do in Georgia and Crimea. But the most common case is what they're doing today in Latvia and what they did in Crimea prior to the occupation, which goes as follows. First of all, Russian television, which is prevalent in many of these countries, pumps out propaganda. Not yet. Second of all, once you have propaganda and you saw the seeds of dissent, they did send planned. In Crimea, they called them little green men because nobody knows where they came from. It's as if they landed from space and started organizing protests. Then, once you have a protest, not yet, which is non-violent and peaceful and quite sensible, someone in the crowd starts throwing a rock or a Molotov cocktail, forcing the police to react, forcing a crackdown. Nobody knows that it is a Russian plan, or rather a Spetsnaz, at which which point you have active dissent because the government is cracking down on non-violent protesters. An example of that happens currently in Latvia, where they funded a lot of really extreme campaigns, both pro and anti-LGBT rights, to the extremes of both sides, to sow dissent and cause people to ideologically fight each other and argue against each other and split the votes, while the Russian party in parliament is gaining from the fact that nobody is fighting them and nobody is taking them down in a moment. We say, and finally we say that when countries Russia do see them as opposing them and going closer to the EU because they say they're against them, then they do start trade wars because Russia is a massive supplier of energy to the Balkans and the Baltics and Eastern Europe. I'll take closing.
Russia's justification for invading Crimea and annexing it was precisely because people wanted it in that country. When you remove that from the historical narrative, you remove that justification for Russia to annex others.
Two things on that. First of all, I have just explained to you that A, Russia has created a lot of that narrative by creating a situation where the Ukraine cracks down on its Russian minorities. Suddenly Russia has to protect it. Note that this did not happen by accident, but it also happened at a time where the Ukraine was dangerously close to becoming closer to the EU, with the EU, signing more trade agreements and favoring the EU in trade over Russia, becoming closer to that, falling into the narrative that I've already explained to you on how Russia sees this as a zero-sum game. But second of all, let's talk about how this is harmful as a society. First, we say, when you have Russian societies still living within your country, people still identifying with Russia, then exactly what happens is, when you portray Russia are occupiers, we have a history of fighting them. They were against us and conquerors against us that we had to fight militarily. This encouraged hatred. This encouraged, first of all, discrimination at the most basic level, when you say, these are people that are in opposition to us, and on the common day-to-day basis, you're not as nice to them. You do not prioritize them in services. The day-to-day discrimination that African Americans, for example, experience in the United States simply because they get lesser service everywhere. The police is less inclined to believe and help them because they see them as something that is against them or that they are afraid of. We say that narrative is harmful. We say it also encourages active violence against them, as happens in, for example, South Africa, where they keep saying how the white people were the oppressors. We had to actively fight them. We have to kick them away because they were against us. So it is legitimate to continue fighting them because they are the oppressors. Finally, we say that this ruins the political system because it creates a narrative of us versus them. It creates a narrative that people going against the government, peddling anti-government ideas are Russian plans, especially when we see Russia meddling worldwide, and it gives countries the legitimacy to take increasing amount of power from the citizens to harm them.
The main difference between our case and opening opposition's case is that while we take the time to explain the narratives and how it spreads through society, both through Russia and in those countries, opposition assumes their narrative and then just roll with it to whatever the hell that they want to make an impact out of. Look, it's just very unclear why the fact that those countries that, as we've heard, have been, first of all, some of them have been emphasizing that struggle, and they still have all those ethnic tensions. B, when they have real minorities that do have real legitimate grievances with the government, it's very unclear how the idea that, okay, but once upon a time, we fought against this huge power, and now what? How does that in any way create social cohesiveness? How does that in any way change anything about the situation of these minorities? They feel part of what? How long will they keep feeling part of whatever the hell it is, this country, if it never does anything for them? So they have a huge assumption, it's just never proven. I'm going to go through a substantial rebuttal. Then I'm going to talk about why in the short run it's a very bad idea anytime to construct a narrative, and specifically in those countries, to construct a narrative around armed struggles. Before that, as promised, rebuttal. So, first of all, we heard that what you do is you need to resist Russian soft power. Sure you do. How the hell do you do it? We don't know. Russia is very good at doing what they're doing. Look, like people in Latvia, like obviously know what we know. We're not smarter than the people of Latvia. But the problem is that when you see those people on the street, it's very hard to know how much of it is Russian propaganda and how much of it is true. It's exactly like we see in the US. We all know that Russia used propaganda in the US election, but how much? To what extent? Do we have enemies within us? Do we not? This is exactly the sort of doubt and dissent that you saw within a country. But then they say, no, Russia can't do all of that. They have very small economical and military power. A, they've just explained that they could. But B, obviously, comparatively to these, tiny countries, they do have a lot of both economical and military power. Like compared to like the Baltic states, which have like a very several million people and like one of the shittiest armies in the world. Like we don't see how is that like something that they could resist. More than that, as we've explained, and this is important, Russia controls energy. Now, if you want to play chicken and see who can last longer, Russia, without selling energy to a very small part of their energy export, or how long the Baltics could stay without electricity, we think the Baltics would blink first. Then they say, but Russia already has an incentive to do all of that anyway. No, we explained it. As long as those governments are pro-Russian, or at least not explicitly anti-Russian, they actually want them to be stable. Why? For the reasons that we've heard from OO, because they want to sell stuff to them, because they want a stable country that don't have like rebels or terrorists or whatever. It's only that when they think that this country is anti-Russian, then they want to destabilize it. This is what pushes them in that situation. But then they say, oh, but won't they have good defense deals with the West? So did Ukraine. How well did that go? Like we really don't see why is that enough. We really don't see why NATO would risk a third world war to defend a country which is from like soft power interventions, right? Like this is not something that would happen. But then they say, okay, but they always want to portray them as enemies. Again, no, they want them to be pro, or at least not explicitly anti-Russian. This is what the Russian citizens want. This is what Putin wants. But then getting to their actual case, because they're telling us, just a second, what happened to my clock? Okay, but then getting to the actual case, they say, no, but you can unite the minorities because everyone suffered under Russia. And it's okay. And at this point, we're going to start my own analysis because we're saying they do not understand how people use that narrative. The main way to use such a narrative of armed struggle is exactly against minorities. I'm going to explain it in a second. Also, please notice they had no rebuttal to our case that already Eli has brought you. But before I move on to my analysis, let's take a POI from first.
Well, you're about to respond to this argument, but I'm just going to say it. How do you make the Muslim majority Kazakhs care about the Christian minority, other than by saying you fought together and that's what makes you deserve being in the same state?
We all enjoy the same foods, it could be a good idea. We all have the same flag. You have both Muslim and Christian players on your national football team. Like, any way you do it anywhere else, and specifically, we don't think that is a good way. Why? We're saying, look, what is the narrative of armed struggle about? It's about we have been oppressed as a nation to begin with. Now, this is important because already that oppressed as a nation assumes this sort of cohesive nation that we had beforehand, and this is what Russia has taken from us, right? So already this usually excludes the minority to begin with. But then it moves on to we had this incredible outside force that has forced us into the things that we don't like. Now, what does that specifically justify? A, it justifies the use of violence because that was an armed struggle. But also it justifies the use of lawlessness, of just breaking the law, because those are not your laws, those are laws dictated by outsiders. Now, why is that bad? Because both those narratives are being used in order to destabilize a country and create ethnic strifes. How does that happen? First of all, let's take it from the point of view of the state. The state used this to justify taking more and more powers, right? How do they do it? Because they say, look, we are the representation of the people. Anyone who is not us is clearly not a representation of the people. They are an outside force. This is exactly what we see in Hungary and Poland today. Now, this goes against usually two main places. A, against any kind of checks and balances on the democratic systems, against the courts, against media, and stuff like that. That means that now the government has a lot of power, but a lot less checks and balances to make sure they do not abuse that power. More than that, we're saying specifically in those countries that have been been post-Soviet, where they don't have a long tradition of democratic checks and balances. It's even worse because they really need anything they can do in order to maintain those checks and balances. But B was saying this exactly goes against minorities because it's anyone is an outsider. Sure, they're not Russian, but are they an outsider? Absolutely. So this exactly goes against Muslims, against Jews, against immigrants, against anyone, against people of the opposition party, anyone that you're saying he's not part of us, and we are just like that. Then we used violence in order to eradicate that threat. Now we're doing the same thing here, and this is how you justify it. But you know what? It gets even one level worse because what do the opposition party does? They say, no, we are just like those who rebelled. They are the outside force, so we are okay in using violence ourselves, in justifying lawlessness and breaking the laws ourselves because it's not our laws. This is how you crumble a state from within. Is it going to happen every time? No. Sometimes, too many times, we say yes.
The deputy leader of opposition can call upon the member of government to open the vote now. You're here.
At the birth of a new state, the central focus of our construction should be one that forced the belief that we could live together. I think that OO was incredibly convenient when they characterized the struggle against Russian oppression as one that every citizen agreed with. I think the reality is it is far more nuanced than that, and we then have to identify and analyze how the pre-colonial histories of these nations worked. 3 issues. First, why emphasizing the struggle symbolically antagonizes Russia? Second, which is a more inclusive framework? And third, relations around the world. First, why emphasizing the struggle symbolically antagonizes Russia? The one reason OG tells you as to why Russia will be likely antagonized is that Russia needs to secure its borders. The problem is, we agree with OO when we say that we're unsure why this incentive then changes. I think we need to analyze the incentives of Putin plus the pawns of power that he uses to further his own political goals and identify why they are likely to change under our scenario. But firstly, let's identify how the emphasis of struggle is likely to look like under their side of the house. First, it was things such as highlighting the victors and the losers of that struggle. It was things such as saying Russia was the oppressor. It was things such as saying Russia was a demonic evil being that raped our land. But secondly, it was also things such as venerating the separatists, lionizing and championing the people who fought for your power, and things like that. With that in mind, there are 2 things to say here as to why we no longer antagonize Russia. The first is that OO rightly tells us that Putin's legitimacy as a government is premised on the idea that he is a strong man. The problem is, any nation outside that boundary highlighting that struggle is an attack on that strongman image. This means that Putin has an added incentive to oppress further insofar as his legitimacy is primarily based on the strong nature of that strongman image. No thank you. But second, note as well that we think Putin is likely to steer the oppression of Russian ethnics in his favor. Here's what OG told you, Sid. OG told you that these Russian ethnics in these areas are likely to be oppressed. We agree. But we think there's something further here that we need to talk about, which is the fact is Putin relies on these Russian separatists, relies on these local Russians to further oppress these people. What does this mean, right? Because we think that the impact is Putin is more likely to be able to convince these people that Russia was the motherland that accepted you, that Russia was not the country that is actively painting you as an aggressor. What does this mean? This means 2 things. Firstly, that these people are significantly more likely to be amenable to rebelling against the Ukrainian government and rebelling against the Polish government. The one thing that OO said to this idea was that, these people did not support Russia because it was very economically damaging. This is where we need to explore the nuance of the nature of that separation. Because when Russia entered into this country, Sid, they promised these people that they could enter into their home. They promised these people prosperity. They promised them that Russia had their back, and eventually you would be able to return to the motherland. This means that, yes, sure, like, they still hurt from the economic damage, but ultimately they adhered to a promise that their lives would be better off, which was promised by Russia. Sid. But secondly, this means that these people are more likely to channel that dissatisfaction toward locals. And we see this, for example, when the Ukraine annexation necessitates that these people saw themselves as an other as opposed to the locals. You create a conduit for Putin to oppress further. Note that this is an extension on OG, when they simply told us that you oppress these people, we're telling you you oppress these people and entrench oppression, and entrench the oppression by Russia to a significant degree. Yes, calm down guys, yes, this means that Putin's propaganda machine is strong, but Putin has a lesser incentive, but more importantly, lesser capability to shift the minds of the people insofar as they're not antagonized. Next, let's talk about an inclusive framework. Sid. O tells you that former notions of indigeneity and culture necessarily is not unifying. That to be a Kazakh means I have to hate Uzbeks. There are a couple things to say here. First is that if they can fiat that they're going to highlight the oppression of the people without highlighting the more dodgier parts, such as the fact that some people were complicit in the oppression, that means we can fiat more inclusive forms of culture as well, the more unifying parts, and like sever the more like dodgy parts of history, and in those cases, we think we're better off in those circumstances. But the next thing OO does, which is quite smart, then push towards the idea that no other form of like culture, like of binding, is as unifying because there's no shared history. There are two things to say here. The first is that the fact that these people have agreed to form a nation probably hints to the fact that they've had the collective will to live together. This means that they've compromised in forming a constitution. This means that they've agreed certain electoral boundaries. They've ceded their own tribal privileges in those instances. We expect people to unify regardless because the notion of nationalism and the idea that we can live together under one flag, under one banner, under one nation is an incredibly empowering one regardless. But secondly, this idea from OO also operates under the assumption that the struggle was a unifying factor. But the reality is the struggle was more nuanced, right? I think OO is incredibly assertive in this regard. Because often these people were complicit in supporting Russia. And note, this was the active Russian strategy to make sure that people were less better off. What did these people do, Sid? These people, the Russians did things such as manufacture a divide and rule strategy where they actively antagonize different groups of people against each other and ensure that the people who supported them then antagonize the other. It was also things such as like the minorities, like the Muslims in those areas, feared how their livelihoods and their futures look like in the future. This means Russians were able to pander to those minorities and promise them a better life in the future as well. It was a complete assertion that the colonial narrative was one that was unifying, and I think at the very least, it's a wash under their side of the house. Sure, yeah.
You seem to have taken Pravda's name very literally. Local Russians are overwhelmingly likely not to support the Russian government's actions for 5 structural reasons that I've given to you, none of which you responded to.
The structural reasons ignore the fact that these people have no alternative in the instance in which you oppress these people at all. Lastly, let's talk about relations around the world. OO says aligning yourself with a political bloc means we send a signaling message to the West that we are your friend. Couple things to say here. The first is that I don't think NATO scrutinizes Polish textbooks, right? I think it's pretty intuitive. But secondly, more importantly, this idea assumes that our best friends are in fact the West. Our stance is that we are fine relying with Russia because we think that they're more important for trade, and alienating them to any degree significantly compromises the ability of the West to then get, of these countries to get better. The first reason is simply because of geographical proximity. The fact that the vast amounts of trade is likely to be more fluid insofar as you're trading with Russia and not the West. The second is that US and Europe is increasingly more isolationist, where they are less likely to fund these former Soviet Union countries. We see this when Trump pulls out of NATO. We see like the fact that the NATO accession talks are taking literally 20 years probably points to the fact that these people probably don't like these Soviet Union countries anyways. But thirdly, the fact is, because Russia is likely to have less options, because the fact that like currently the vast majority of the world are sanctioning against Russia, this probably points to the fact that the bargaining table is more likely to be skewed toward us. This means that the deals we get are significantly better. Ladies and gentlemen, to form a collective nation, we can't let any group forget the idea that we can live together. Very proud.
I thank the member of government and call upon the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
They continuously try to push to us the fact that Russian aggression is going to increase at the point at which Putin believes he's a strong man image and he has to maintain that image. Look, here's the thing, right? Putin wants to maintain his image on both sides of the house. That is to say that he wants like actual physical impacts of his actions, which means on both sides of the house, he's probably going to try to take over these nations regardless, but at least on our side, we like provide a stronger front, right? Because oftentimes Putin's justification to his people as to why he wants to take over these nations, places like Ukraine, is that the people in these nations want it. Is that the people in these nations want to become part of Russia again, right? By imposing a national identity that is inherently anti-Russia, you ensure that Putin cannot use that as a justification any longer to say that those people want to be in the nation. But moreover, we think that like Russian aggression probably exists on both sides of the house at the point at which Putin will impose tangible actions to ensure that other people find him to be a strong leader, right? Then they try to like give us this argument about how like, oh, it's not like a closing government tries to give us this argument about how it wasn't a unifying factor when we fought off Russia, when Russia controlled us, because a lot of people actually supported Russia. Look, here's the thing, right? A lot of times what happens now is that those individuals don't support Russia anymore. They see that in the past, Russia actively manipulated them, actively told them to go against their family, go against their society, and essentially cause their society and their family to be harmed. By seeing those kinds of reactions, by understanding that Russia was the reason why their economy is decimated, why like their people, why their friends and their family were harmed, why their family and friends were starving, this essentially means that people probably see this as a unifying factor in the status quo, even if previously their thoughts on it might have been like conflicting or something of the sort. Then they try to give us this argument that there are other forms of unification at the point at which a state is formed, which means that the collective will to live together. Look, here's the thing. At the point at which there is ethnic tension and strife in these nations, we think that collective will has essentially failed, right? Because you can't just say people formed a nation, which means everyone automatically will live harmoniously with each other. You have to give them a strengthening bond. You have to give them a reason to believe that they should like care about each other. But the thing is, okay, moving on to like two main points of extension, explaining why they're important. Before that, sure, I'll take opening.
Minorities don't just suffer because they are not black. Minorities suffer when a state with little to no checks and balances uses the armed struggle narrative to consolidate power by turning the majority against them.
Wait, can you repeat that? I didn't really understand.
Minorities don't suffer because they are not black. Minorities suffer when a state with little to no checks and balances uses the armed struggle narrative to consolidate power by turning the majority against them.
Actually, this is perfect because this leads me to later on when we talk about how the ideals of the struggle intrinsically mean that the majority will actually care about the minority, right? All right, so like I'll just respond to that later. I'll flag it out if you really need me to. But the thing is, they can't just continuously run this argument that like local Russians will like be really hurt and things like that, because we posit to you that local Russians in these areas generally were ones that were forced out of Russia in the first place through things like internment camps and death camps that Russia forced on them. But even so, the fact that they deliberately choose to move to another nation means that they probably don't care that much about Russia anyways, right? All right, so OO did not really explain the mechanism of how the solidarity is achieved. Because we tell you that it's not just about a common oppression, it's also about these existing problems. Because we tell you that in the status quo, people often hate each other, right? Like the memories of the civil wars, the conflicts in places like Yugoslavia, and places like in Bosnia, Serbia, these countries that were previously Soviet Union are still rife in their minds. There's constant conflict. And they often create a situation in which they blame each other for these problems, right? But we tell you, by using this narrative, by having this common narrative, we can scapegoat, to some extent, USSR for the problems of the status quo. That is to say that you can say the USSR is the reason why, and this is probably accurate anyways, that our economy is failing, is the reason why all of these things are not going our way, right? So instead of blaming each other, instead of pitting the nation against each other, you create a common goal, a common enemy for these individuals to hate within the nation, rather than blaming their current structural issues on each other. But moreover, we tell you that this is the most important thing, right? Because it actually has tangible impacts. We tell you that the ideals of being anti-imperialism are very important in this case. What do these ideals look like? There are things like independence. There are things like democracy. There are things like we do not support oppression. There are things like we do not support the majority constantly being the tyranny, the majority constantly fighting off the minority, right? Because at the point at which your national identity, all your streetcars, all your like street signs, all your roads, all the like anthems that you sing about are about how like we should not have this big bad bully constantly try to bully the minority. We should not have this like type of imperialism occur. This essentially means that you reject the taking of rights of other individuals, right? Which essentially means you reinforce norms of democracy and freedom in these nations. Because sure, we understand in the past there was imperialism, but at the point at which you take the active step and say we do not support these actions, we do not support bigger nations coming in and like harming or like manipulating the majority, you are essentially saying that these kinds of actions are not okay universally, right? You're saying saying that these actions are not okay domestically either, right? By saying that the majority in these nations should not be harming the minority, by saying, like, by essentially agreeing to these anti-imperialism, like, claims, right? That larger powers should not just overpower unjustly every other individual. What are the, we say that this is, like, similar to the way that the U.S. has functioned, right? By the fact that the U.S. also builds their national identity off of their independence, off of their anti-colonial struggles. This is why the U.S. is, like, very afraid of, like, tyrannical governments that can dictate them. This is why the U.S. doesn't, like, always allows minority voice and does not allow for tyranny of the majority in many places, such as in their political fields and things like that, right? Because they recognize the fact that they, like, they care about things like freedom. They care about things like no oppression. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, we say that in the future, if large nations ever come in the future, which is highly likely for these nations that might be smaller, we say it's likely that there's going to be increased scrutiny against them. We think that this is likely that people will point to these past experiences, be like, we do not want to experience that again. We do not want to be subject to the same things that happened to us in the past, and likely will be like, will try even harder to fight against these larger forces and, like, develop allies and things like that. But we're secondly saying that these people are likely to go against tyrannical policies, right? Because they want to move forward to create a better and more stable nation at the point in which they're likely to promote for institutions that, like, ensure that this kind of tyrannical behavior doesn't exist anymore, right? Because when your national identity is built off the ideals that we should not focus on, we should not allow for tyranny, we should not allow for colonialism, we should not allow for imperialism, we say it's highly likely that you will build norms in society that refuse and reject authoritarianism, ensure that future leaders have checks and balances placed against them at the point at which that is essentially the ideals that now define your society at large. Extremely proud to oppose.
I take the member in opposition and call upon the government whip to close out the government bench in this debate. Here.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to sum up this debate under 2 points. First of all, about unity. On which side is there more unity between the majority and minorities in these countries? And secondly, I'm going to talk about on which side is Russian aggression more likely and more effective in these countries. Before that, some extremist rebuttals, both to OO and CO. So first of all, this idea that now Putin cannot use the justification that these people want us to intervene in these countries. I don't think that works, because now Putin can use the justification that the people who are pro-Russia in these countries are being discriminated against and are being significantly attacked just because of their ethnicities, because they tend to share the ethnicities that were seen as oppressing them in the past. I don't think that works. Secondly, this idea that the people who are, the Russian people inside these countries are, like, totally against Russia, right? Because these were people who were chased out of Russia. That does not make sense. That was Russia at that point, Madam Speaker, and these people just could not move. You can't imagine, as soon as the states break up, for everyone to be able to move in their specified boxes. We think many of these people would rather be in Russia if only they could move. Exactly the same for many of the Muslims in places such as India, right? So I don't think that line of analysis works. Thirdly, some specific rebuttals to the stuff that we heard from CO, right? So first of all, this idea that now instead of blaming structural issues and blaming economic failures on each other, you can just blame the USSR. I think that's a problem in many of the countries who have a history of colonial oppression, that they can, that the governments can get away for a very, very long time on just pointing to the history of oppression rather than proving to the people that we are actually improving and we are doing something about structural issues. So I don't think that that works. But also, to what extent can you get away from blaming each other and only, like, blaming the structural, only blaming the previous oppression, because presumably that oppression was significantly in the past. I don't think you can do that like continuously into the future, right? And finally, this stuff about the US, because of its history of oppression, doesn't allow tyrannical governments. Like, really, I think US is one of the most oppressive nations on earth. I think that line of analysis or that analogy does not really make sense. But I think more importantly, Madam Speaker, sometimes the history of oppression makes nations more aggressive going into the future. I think Israel would be a good example of that in its belligerence against some of the countries that it sees as attacking it. Okay, so moving on to the first point, Madam Speaker, this idea that, about unity, right? So the main line of analysis from OO was that the reason why this is a really unifying message is that everyone can agree that Russia was incredibly bad, and all of us were equally harmed by the Russian policies. We don't think that is true, Madam Speaker, because the way that Russian oppression worked was to benefit some groups to the exclusion of others. That is how all colonial powers operate, because they literally cannot have everyone under their rule without anyone supporting them. So what they do is to give benefits to a small section of people so that those people continue to support them while depriving other people of their rights. We think, secondly, Madam Speaker, even if that's true, that these people were objectively harmed by Russia, Russian propaganda has been mentioned in this debate very often, but people don't realize the strength of it, right? Russia has literally peddled lies into the hearts and minds of these people to the point that they believe that Russia was the motherland that was really caring towards them and really had good policies, and if only for other countries' intervention, they would be living in a happy utopia, right? We think a very good example of this was the invasion of Crimea, which was supported by many people on the ground in those countries who had pro-Russian sentiments. So I don't think that line of analysis worked, right? The second reason why this message was seen as unifying, that we heard from the opposition bench, was that you needed to have everyone unified, everyone fighting against Russia to be able to escape that oppression. Again, that doesn't work, as Khalis told you, Madam Speaker, right? Because again, the way that imperialist powers work is using a policy of divide and rule, where they have some people who support them, such as, for example, Muslims in India, where they allowed the formation of things like the Muslim League to the exclusion of the other people. So we think that same dynamic happened in places such as Russia, where they allowed some people to receive the benefits of the oppression and the deprivation of rights of others while excluding everyone else, Madam Speaker, right? We think the second reason why this wasn't a unified resistance against the Russian Empire, because minorities are very afraid of joining that resistance because they don't know what their place would be in the new nation that will be formed, because it will be the majority ethnicity that will be ruling that nation. So they are really scared. Many of them are very likely to be more supportive of the Russian Empire. What is so what is the problem with this, right? Because they say now Kazakhs will care about the Muslims in Kazakhstan will care about the Christians because all of them were fighting together. And I just told you that in many cases they were not. But what is the comparative here? The comparative here is that on our side, they will still have the fact that these guys are living in the same country. They have some shared culture, or at least they are part of the same project, and they can, through some disagreements, but also move, rising above that, agree to live with each other. But what happens on that side, those people are actively labeled as traitors, people who were supportive of the Russian Empire and Russian imperialism, and are constantly looked at with suspicion moving into this day. So I don't think, Madam Speaker, that is necessarily a better narrative with which to view these people. We think politicians many times use this narrative to blame those people and demonize those people. Before I move on opening.
It's been 60 years since Russia allegedly divided and conquered these countries, which I do not think empirically happened. Compare that to the similarities between these different ethnic groups, which you have still completely failed to point out there being any reasons for existing.
I actually do not understand that, Pio. I'm really sorry. Okay, moving on to the next argument. Why is Russian aggression more likely in these countries? First of all, that side says that Russia is on the brink of economic failure and cannot really do anything, so we really do not need to fear them very much. That's not true, Madam Speaker. Russia has acted irrationally in the past, so even if it's economically failing now, it will make some irrational decisions right now because it gets more territory in the short and the long term, which is ultimately beneficial to it. Also, NATO is significantly weaker because Trump has withdrawn a lot of the support that it gave to NATO, so Russia is more capable of doing that. Why is Russia more capable of intervention now? Because the pro-Russian sentiment in these countries, the people who are pro-Russian, are more likely to support Russia in a world in which those people continue to be demonized and their ethnicities tend to be continue to be demonized, and they are blamed for the atrocities of the past. They don't see themselves as part of this nation, which constantly in its history books exclude them, where the politicians blame them for the atrocities of the past, Madam Speaker. Compare that with what they have coming from the Russian side. That is the Russian propaganda, which says that we all should be part of the Russian motherland, and we will happily accept you if only you support us, Madam Speaker. When you have this conflicting narrative, they are much more likely to side with Russia. What we want, therefore, on our side is not the demonization of Russia and not the demonization of the Russian of those ethnicities, because that will only lead to the failure of those states. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Witness. Call upon the opposition to close out the round. You're here.
Look, I think that a lot of this debate has been done with a disingenuous characterization of what these countries actually look like. And we think that that disingenuous characterization has confused the debate to quite a bit. Let me just try to clarify this with 3 very simple questions. Firstly, I want to talk about international relationships and how we have them better on our side. Secondly, I want to talk about which side engenders better norms within society. And finally, I want to talk about unity. So first, let's talk about relationships on our side of the house. Because the thrust of proposition was very simple, that there's meddling that's going to occur. And we told you how we remove a lot of excuses. The response was, no, but now Russia has an excuse to say, our people are being oppressed within these countries, therefore we have the right to invade. So I think that on both sides of the house, there are probably some type of excuse, and we think whatever excuse there is, Russian propaganda will probably come up with another one on either side of the house. The difference is what the probability is that these countries will actually be able to better fend off Russian invasion. And here's where our extension is incredibly important, because we think that on our side of the house, it becomes far more likely that the West will actually intervene, will actually support these nations, because after they announce or denounce Russia, that ultimately means that these countries are more likely to come in. And their response to this was, but the EU and US are very isolationist, so they won't do this, right? Look, that is disingenuous of the place that these countries have within existing unions. Note the fact that NATO, that the EU already incorporate CIS states in many instances. The fact that NATO actually does give money to many countries, the fact that NATO gives money and supports the commonwealth of these satellite states in many instances means that they are taking steps. The biggest problem, therefore, is that the Western nations right now are very reluctant to take that extra step to defend them against invasion because they aren't pledging allegiance. We solved it on our side of the house when you get that explicit reminder. So on our side of the house, we defend better against Russian aggression, even if Russia has an excuse on either side. Second question, therefore, what are the norms of society? No, thank you. And the biggest problem here was that they misunderstood the context both of Russians in these areas, but also of these types of places. So first, let's talk about Russians in this area, because they say it hurts people and oppresses Russians because they are discriminated against. Here's the problem. These types of people hate Russia, and oftentimes these types of people were forced into these types of places. And they try to say that, no, these people were Russians who were living in Russia until it was no longer Russia. No, but there's a difference between living in the industrial areas of Moscow and living in Poland. And the reason for the vast majority of why Russians are in these types of areas were because of the policies of USSR. Policies like kulakization, policies like collectivization of labor and throwing people out. What happens was that in these particular areas, you got a channeling of Russians who ultimately were thrown out of better parts of Russia and forced to live in these places. Therefore, the vast majority of the Russians we're actually talking about here were victims of the USSR policies that decided to collectivize and redistribute land or collectivize and redistribute property, which means these people, in the vast majority of instances, do not like Russians, right? Okay. What is the comparative context we're talking about? We talked about in our extension how these types of places are highly diverse in ethnic makeup and how tensions are still ripe and active, how the memories of these types of civil wars are still very real. And we think that opening opposition really dropped the ball here, because it's not just the fact that everyone's oppressed so we can empathize with each other's oppression. It's the fact that there are many problems in the status quo and people keep blaming each other for the problems. We solved this on the comparative because now people can scapegoat Russia. They can say, yeah, it was the USSR that was responsible. And to that extent, you get a lot of solidarity as who's a common enemy in this case. And I know that closing tried to say, but this is just an excuse that you can use to blame structural issues against. Look, I think the comparative here is at least we have functional politics in our world, right? Because in their world, far more often than not, you're going to get things like protracted civil wars. You're going to get things like insurgencies because people can't even agree and people all blame each other. We think it's comparatively better. But what was their alternative? They said, we want an inclusive identity. Note, it was totally amorphous as to what this identity was, but let's just deal with the 2 possibilities. 1, you build an identity based on an ethnic makeup before the USSR. If this is the case, this type of identity, which was founded hundreds and hundreds of years ago before the imposition of the USSR, is likely to be highly ethnic in nature. and it's also likely to be highly exclusive in nature. So maybe you want to do it after the USSR was broken up. If that's the case, the only history there in many instances is a history of civil war, of bloody conflict, and of ethnic genocide. So to that extent, we don't really see any good alternatives. Moreover, we told you on our side of the house that using struggle as a place to build national identity is very, very good because it reinforces certain norms within that society, something that we literally heard absolutely no response to. We told you that the defining feature of the USSR imposition was that of imperialism, and therefore the ideals that are necessary to oppose the tyranny of Russia that are championed as a result of this are ideals of liberty, ideals of equality, ideals that you should not oppress minorities because those people were the minorities who were being oppressed by the USSR. To that extent, those ideals are far more reinforced. Before that, I'll take opening.
Both oppositions rely on a nuanced national narrative that is just unlikely to work given Russia's actively sows dissent and counter-narratives in those same countries.
I'll talk about how Russia plants people within these countries later. I'll flag that out in my extension. But what's important to note about the extension that we brought to you was that the national identity that we built here is founded upon certain ideals that are likely to percolate across society, right? And we think that when you ferment these norms there, they're very strong norms. Note the fact that in the USA, people vehemently oppose any idea of restricting freedom of speech because those norms are very similar in there. We think on our side of the house, we're also likely to get that. But secondly, people are likely to oppose things like consolidation, oppose things like tyranny, and oppose things like authoritarianism because the national identity is built against that. More importantly, we want to talk about how this literally works because when we start teaching this national identity within classroom, through holidays, we think that it becomes part of the culture of these types of groups far more. Okay, finally, let's talk about the idea of unity because they said that you're going to divide a lot of people because Russia actively seeks to plant certain insurgent groups. Look, here's the problem. This is also going to affect your side of the house to a far greater extent. And the reason why was because if you have alternatives, such as building an inclusive identity on certain features, these alternatives are also disproportionately likely to exclude Russians to a huge extent if you try to build them on things like the ethnic history here. But more importantly, we think that there is a distinction here because blaming the USSR, which was an oppressive institution, is very distinct from blaming Russians, who were sufferers, who were mutual victims of the oppression you faced. And we think that people are not so naive enough to confuse that disgusting institution with the people who they've known and grown up with for a very long time. And we think it's simply naive of you to say that people are just going to take out all that aggression on people who have suffered through the same things that they've suffered through. We think on our side of the house, you build norms that help create a society that is resistant to backsliding and ultimately promotes democracy. But more importantly, we've shown you why on our side of the house, we were able to unify cultures. For these reasons, very happy to oppose.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Oh, no, we're still missing out.
He's hopping his way over.
Okay.
That's right, you're all left in suspense.
You know what? You can just stop talking. I'll let him know what he is.
Are you sure? I think if he's going to be here in a second. Okay. Is he going to be here in a second, or should we start? Okay. Excellent. Thank you guys so much for an enjoyable debate. Yeah, so I'll give you the decision, and then I'll walk through the teams chronologically to place them. Definitely encourage you to speak with my panelists and have a very good discussion. Awesome. So we ended up giving the 1 to opening government, the 2 to opening opposition, the 3 to closing government, and unfortunately the 4 to closing opposition. Starting with opening government. So I think we get a well-warranted case focused on why Russia perceives a particular threat in pro-Russian governments because they are susceptible to the expansion of the EU and NATO, which based on historical experiences in the Cold War, as well as geographical considerations more broadly, are threatening to Russia's position. Critically, I think in the deputy speech, we also get reasons why Russia would prefer, in the absence of significant threat, their neighbors to be stable, i.e. economic incentives, as well as just having to deal with migration, things of that sort. That difference, I think, is really critical for the opposition teams. I think there's an assumption up and down the bench that Russia will be aggressive no matter what. And I think that from the beginning, we get very particular argumentation about what causes them to be aggressive that isn't, I think, like picked up on in a very tactical way, which ends up being really important in the round. I think beyond that, or after that argumentation, we get, the way that this plays out. So the idea that this is not, like explicitly, usually not military aggression. It is soft power, the very types of things that you tell us they can afford to do and have incentives to do, i.e. becoming of propaganda, maybe using minimal resources in order to foment like moments of violence in the midst of protest, which then escalates and can be used either to justify intervention or just to destabilize countries if they're drifting too far towards the West. So again, I think what's critical to pick up on, we get some inconsistency along the op bench about they can't afford any type of aggressive military intervention. Recognize that they do talk about withholding gas, and so the argument about whether or not they can afford that certainly does apply to what they're talking about. But I think that the case that they say is the majority of interventions that we'll see is not heavily resource intensive. And so that response that we get throughout the bench is not super effective, as well as the fact that it's an odd, inconsistently given you tell me that they'll do these things anyways. I'm not sure what you think they're doing and when. Yes, and then finally, we hear that this also, ethnic Russians will be discriminated against. So an argument not that inherently they will be pro-Russian, but that they will be perceived as such by the rest of the population, which again, the rest of the round kind of like wanders into at times factual assertions about like how these people ended up in these countries, whether or not they're pro-Russia or not. I don't think that that debate is a wash, but critically, I think that we get a version of this argument from OG that is not dependent upon whether we think the people themselves are pro-Russian, but how they will be perceived by the rest of the population based on their ethnic identity. Great, moving on to opening opposition. I think we hear, refutation as well as, again, some of the claims that I talked about being maybe a bit under-responsive. So the idea that this will happen no matter what without being, I think, detailed enough about what types of interventions you think will happen no matter what, and particularly why. And so that made it difficult for me. Like, I can certainly imagine, and I think it's intuitive, that some of these interventions, that Putin always has an incentive to engage in, but I'm just not sure which ones that were discussed, which ended up being a little bit difficult. Yes, and then telling us, you do a good job explaining to us, why there would be benefits in foreign powers as allies in the absence. So I think the argument about the absence of gas, for example, is like very well refuted with your economic arguments, as well as the possibility of other allies. And then finally, I think you do a good job of explaining why, if we believe that everyone participated in this struggle, and if we believe that the alternative is an identity that is based on historical divisions, this perhaps could lead to more unity. I think that it maybe goes a bit far. Like, what I needed is an argument about why the alternative is not just possible. Sorry, let me back that up. Why it is not just possible that the national identity that we'll see on Gov is going to be based on ethnic divisions, but why it is likely, like why there are incentives within the government as it exists at this time to create that identity, especially since, it seems not in the interest of nation building. Which I think then would have made the debate like narrower on the front half, is just that level of like not just possibility but likelihood. Moving back to the deputy speech, as I already mentioned, I think we get really good additional warranting about why it is the case that this discussion of will Russia intervene on either side, they will not intervene in the absence of like very real threats. And then I think really strong additional substantive material that goes relatively unresponded to throughout the opposition bench about the way that these narratives can be instrumentalized in the absence even of intervention by Russia, or in the presence of the perception of a group of people who are pro-Russian, even if they're not, to either break down democracy or do bad things. From the DLO, I think that there's not sufficient engagement with the new material that comes out of the deputy speech on Gov. And so we hear again, it's kind of like this delicate balance where you tell me, essentially the narratives are not going to be against Putin today, but against the Soviet Union. So it's the perfect level where you'll be able to combat interference by Russia, if it's the case that it exists on either side, but not enough to encourage Russian intervention. And I wasn't sure how you would strike that perfect middle ground. Like, I believe that that is possible, but again, the likelihood, not just possibility, was the part that was not sufficiently substantiated for me. And then again, for me, the argument about this will happen on either side, so no matter what, I don't think was sufficiently established. Introducing closing government, I think very significant contribution in just pointing out, like, it matters. This is probably not going to be a completely inclusive identity insofar as there are structural reasons why the Soviet Union did not include everyone equally within society, and as a result, it's unlikely that everyone was part of the rebellion isn't going to create a completely united identity, which is helpful, especially in comparison to the back half. I think, unfortunately, there is not sufficient engagement with the material that the team on the short diagonal from you engaged in. So they give us argumentation about why they think it is likely, like particularly likely, that ethnic Russians, for example, would not be in favor of modern day Russia. And this is even flagged in the POI that you haven't engaged with it. And so I think that as a result, it was difficult to place you above that team, just because I think that they did, like a good amount of their argumentation was substantiated quite well. And then, in addition, yes. Oh, yes, and then in addition, I think your argumentation in comparison to the team in front of you is more dependent upon this factual squabble over whether or not the current ethnic Russians are pro-Russia or not, rather than focusing on perception and then domestically this will impact people. And so as a result, given that it is just a harder debate for me to adjudicate, like obviously I have my own thoughts on like what I believe to be factually true, strategically I think the arguments from your opening team just stood much more robustly on that area than your conceptualization of it, even though you were very responsive to your back half team on that issue. So moving on and introducing closing opposition. So I think that some of your material was to some degree derivative of your opening team. So, the arguments about international relations and how you'll have better engagement with the West, I think your front half team certainly touched upon quite explicitly. In addition, I think that you fell victim a bit to you impact that in like a very militarily oriented way, and I was particularly confused in some of your extension. This rock in a hard place of Russia cannot afford to intervene. Like your opening team has boxed you into that pretty significantly, and you even agree with them. And yet the reason you need backup from the West is because you need support in case of what seems like a violent conflict. So I just wasn't sure how to navigate that. And then again, I think there was a little bit of lack of responsiveness to the team across from you, as they point out that you are not able to create a fully unified identity if it's the case that, not just as an assertion, but they give me the warrants that if resources are constrained, it's very difficult to subjugate an entire population. As a result, it's likely that you would divide and conquer, so not everyone is going to be supportive. Also just risk aversity, like these people probably don't know what their place is going to be in the future, so why would they rebel? We hear some statements, some of which I found a little bit confusing also, about experience of collectivization and things of that sort, but not sufficient reasons to believe them, if that makes sense, as to why you thought that the current ethnic Russians would end up being more or less likely to be separatists at the moment. So it was a problem of engagement with the team across from you, and then I think a lot of your substantive material was somewhat derivative of your opening team, and that's why you placed behind them as well. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Really happy to chat more. Thanks for the round. Hope you enjoy the rest of your tournament.